Chapter 2. When Cousin Stickles knocked at her door, Valancy knew it was 7:30 and she must get up. As long as she could remember, Cousin Stickles had knocked at her door at 7:30. Cousin Stickles and Mrs. Frederick Sterling had been up since 7, but Valancy was allowed to lie abed half an hour longer because of a family tradition that she was delicate. Valancy got up, though she hated getting up more this morning than ever she had before. What was there to get up for? Another dreary day like all the days that had preceded it, full of meaningless little tasks, joyless and unimportant, that benefited nobody. But if she did not get up at once, she would not be ready for breakfast at 8 o'clock. Hard and fast times for meals were the rule in Mrs. Sterling's household. Breakfast at 8, dinner at 1, supper at 6, year in and year out. No excuses for being late were ever tolerated. So up Valancy got, shivering. The room was bitterly cold with the raw, penetrating chill of a wet May morning. The house would be cold all day. It was one of Mrs. Frederick's rules that no fires were necessary after the 24th of May. Meals were cooked on the little oil stove in the back porch. And though May might be icy and October frostbitten, no fires were lighted until the 21st of October by the calendar. On the 21st of October, Mrs. Frederick began cooking over the kitchen range and lighted a fire in the sitting room stove in the evenings. It was whispered about in the connection that the late Frederick Sterling had caught the cold which resulted in his death during Valancy's first year of life because Mrs. Frederick would not have a fire on the 20th of October. She lighted it the next day, but that was a day too late for Frederick Sterling. Valancy took off and hung up in the closet her nightdress of coarse, unbleached cotton, with high neck and long, tight sleeves. She put on undergarments of a similar nature, a dress of brown gingham, thick black stockings, and rubber-heeled boots. Of late years, she had fallen into the habit of doing her hair with the shade of the window by the looking-glass pulled down. The lines on her face did not show so plainly then. But this morning she jerked the shade to the very top and looked at herself in the leprous mirror with a passionate determination to see herself as the world saw her.
The result was rather dreadful. Even a beauty would have found that harsh, unsoftened side light trying. Valancy saw straight black hair, short and thin, always lusterless, despite the fact that she gave it 100 strokes of the brush, neither more nor less, every night of her life, and faithfully rubbed Redfern's hair vigor into the roots, more lusterless than ever in its morning roughness. Fine, straight black brows, a nose she had always felt was much too small even for her small, three-cornered white face, a small, pale mouth that always fell open a trifle over little, pointed white teeth, a figure thin and flat-breasted, rather below the average height. She had somehow escaped the family high cheekbones, and her dark brown eyes, too soft and shadowy to be black, had a slant that was almost oriental. Apart from her eyes, she was neither pretty nor ugly, just insignificant-looking, she concluded bitterly. How plain the lines around her eyes and mouth were in that merciless light, and never had her narrow, white face looked so narrow and so white. She did her hair in a pompadour. Pompadours had long gone out of fashion, but they had been when Valancy first put her hair up, and Aunt Wellington had decided that she must always wear her hair so. It is the only way that becomes you. Your face is so small that you must add height to it by a pompadour effect, said Aunt Wellington, who always enunciated commonplaces as if uttering profound and important truths. Valancy had hankered to do her hair pulled low on her forehead, with puffs above the ears, as Olive was wearing hers, but Aunt Wellington's dictum had such an effect on her that she never dared change her hairstyle again. But then, there were so many things Valancy never dared do. All her life she had been afraid of something, she thought bitterly. From the very dawn of recollection, when she had been so horribly afraid of the big black bear that lived, so Cousin Stickles told her, in the closet under the stairs. And I always will be. I know it. I can't help it. I don't know what it would be like not to be afraid of something.
Afraid of her mother's sulky fits, afraid of offending Uncle Benjamin, afraid of becoming a target for Aunt Wellington's contempt, afraid of Aunt Isabel's biting comments, afraid of Uncle James' disapproval, afraid of offending the whole clan's opinions and prejudices, afraid of not keeping up appearances, afraid to say what she really thought of anything, afraid of poverty in her old age. Fear, fear, fear. She could never escape from it. It bound her and enmeshed her like a spider's web of steel. Only in her blue castle could she find temporary release. And this morning, Valancy could not believe she had a blue castle. She would never be able to find it again. 29, unmarried, undesired. What had she to do with the fairy-like chatelaine of the blue castle? She would cut such childish nonsense out of her life forever and face reality unflinchingly. She turned from her unfriendly mirror and looked out. The ugliness of the view always struck her like a blow. The ragged fence, the tumble-down old carriage shop in the next lot, plastered with crude, violently colored advertisements, the grimy railway station beyond, with the awful derelicts that were always hanging around it, even at this early hour. In the pouring rain, everything looked worse than usual, especially the beastly advertisement, "Keep that schoolgirl complexion." Valancy had kept her schoolgirl complexion. That was just the trouble. There was not a gleam of beauty anywhere. Exactly like my life, thought Valancy drearily. Her brief bitterness had passed. She accepted facts as resignedly as she had always accepted them. She was one of the people whom life always passes by. There was no altering that fact. In this mood, Valancy went down to breakfast. Chapter 3. Breakfast was always the same. Oatmeal porridge, which Valancy loathed, toast and tea, and 1 teaspoonful of marmalade. Mrs. Frederick thought 2 teaspoonfuls extravagant, but that did not matter to Valancy, who hated marmalade too. The chilly, gloomy little dining room was chillier and gloomier than usual. The rain streamed down outside the window. Departed sterlings in atrocious gilt frames wider than the pictures glowered down from the walls. And yet Cousin Stickles wished Valancy many happy returns of the day. "Sit up straight, Doss," was all her mother said. Valancy sat up straight. She talked to her mother and Cousin Stickles of the things they always talked of. She never wondered what would happen if she tried to talk of something else. She knew. Therefore, she never did it. Mrs. Frederick was offended with Providence for sending a rainy day when she wanted to go to a picnic, so she ate her breakfast in a sulky silence for which Valancy was rather grateful. But Christine Stickles whined endlessly on as usual, complaining about everything: the weather, the leak in the pantry, the price of oatmeal and butter. Valancy felt at once she had buttered her toast too lavishly. The epidemic of mumps in Deerwood.
"Das will be sure to catch them," she foreboded. "Das must not go where she is likely to catch mumps," said Mrs. Frederick shortly. Valancy had never had mumps, or whooping cough, or chicken pox, or measles, or anything she should have had. Nothing but horrible colds every winter. Das's winter colds were a sort of tradition in the family. Nothing, it seems, could prevent her from catching them. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles did their heroic best. One winter they kept Valancy housed up from November to May in the warm sitting room. She was not even allowed to go to church, and Valancy took cold after cold and ended up with bronchitis in June. "None of my family were ever like that," said Mrs. Frederick, implying that it must be a Sterling tendency. "The Sterlings seldom take colds," said Cousin Stickles resentfully. She had been a Sterling. "I think," said Mrs. Frederick, "that if a person makes up her mind not to have colds, she will not have colds." So that was the trouble. It was all Valancy's own fault. But on this particular morning, Valancy's unbearable grievance was that she was called Das. She had endured it for 29 years, and all at once she felt she could not endure it any longer. Her full name was Valancy Jane. Valancy Jane was rather terrible, but she liked Valancy, with its odd outland tang. It was always a wonder to Valancy that the Sterlings had allowed her to be so christened. She had been told that her maternal grandfather, old Amos Wansborough, had chosen the name for her. Her father had tacked on the Jane by way of civilizing it, and the whole connection got out of the difficulty by nicknaming her Doss. She never got Valancy from anyone but outsiders. "Mother," she said timidly, "would you mind calling me Valancy, Altiers? Doss seems so I don't like it." Mrs. Frederick looked at her daughter in astonishment. She wore glasses with enormously strong lenses that gave her eyes a peculiarly disagreeable appearance. "What is the matter with Doss?" "It seems so childish," faltered Valancy. Oh, Mrs. Frederick had been a Wansborough, and the Wansborough smile was not an asset. "I see. Well, it should suit you then. You are childish enough in all conscience, my dear child." "I am 29, said the dear child desperately. "I wouldn't proclaim it from the housetops if I were you, dear," said Mrs. Frederick. 29? I had been married 9 years when I was 29. "I was married at 17, said Cousin Stickles proudly.
Valancy looked at them furtively. Mrs. Frederick, except for those terrible glasses and the hooked nose that made her look more like a parrot than a parrot itself could look, was not ill-looking. At 20 she might have been quite pretty. But Cousin Stickles... And yet Christine Stickles had once been desirable in some man's eyes. Valancy felt that Cousin Stickles, with her broad, flat, wrinkled face, a mole right on the end of her dumpy nose, bristling hairs on her chin, wrinkled yellow neck, pale, protruding eyes, and thin, puckered mouth, had yet this advantage over her, this right to look down on her. And even yet Cousin Stickles was necessary to Mrs. Frederick. Valancy wondered pitifully what it would be like to be wanted by someone, needed by someone. No one in the whole world needed her, or would miss anything from life if she dropped suddenly out of it. She was a disappointment to her mother. No one loved her. She had never so much as had a girlfriend. "I haven't even a gift for friendship," she had once admitted to herself pitifully. "Doss, you haven't eaten your crusts," said Mrs. Frederick rebukingly. It rained all the forenoon without cessation. Valancy pieced a quilt. Valancy hated piecing quilts, and there was no need of it. The house was full of quilts. There were 3 big chests packed with quilts in the attic. Mrs. Frederick had begun storing away quilts when Valancy was 17, and she kept on storing them, though it did not seem likely that Valancy would ever need them. But Valancy must be at work, and fancy work materials were too expensive. Idleness was a cardinal sin in the Sterling household. When Valancy had been a child, she had been made to write down every night in a small, hated black notebook all the minutes she had spent in idleness that day. On Sundays, her mother made her tot them up and pray over them. On this particular forenoon of this day of destiny, Valancy spent only 10 minutes in idleness. At least, Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles would have called it idleness. She went to her room to get a bed of thimble, and she opened Thistle Harvest guiltily at random.
"The woods are so human," wrote John Foster, "that to know them one must live with them. An occasional saunter through them, keeping to the well-trodden paths, will never admit us to their intimacy. If we wish to be friends, we must seek them out and win them by frequent, reverent visits at all hours, by morning, by noon, and by night, and at all seasons, in spring, in summer, in autumn, and winter. Otherwise, we can never really know them, and any pretense we may make to the contrary will never impose on them. They have their own effective way of keeping aliens at a distance and shutting their hearts to mere casual sightseers. It is of no use to seek the woods from any motive except sheer love of them. They will find us out at once and hide all their sweet old-world secrets from us. But if they know we come to them because we love them, they will be very kind to us and give us such treasures of beauty and delight as are not bought or sold in any marketplace. For the woods, when they give it all, give unstintedly and hold nothing back from their true worshipers. We must go to them lovingly, humbly, patiently, watchfully, and we shall learn what poignant loveliness lurks in the wild places and silent intervales, lying under starshine and sunset. What cadences of unearthly music are hopped on aged pine boughs or crooned in copses of fir. What delicate savors exhale from mosses and ferns in sunny corners or on damp brooklands. What dreams and myths and legends of an older time haunt them. Then the immortal heart of the woods will beat against ours, and its subtle life will steal into our veins and make us its own forever, so that no matter where we go or how widely we wander, we shall yet be drawn back to the forest to find our most enduring kinship. "Doss," called her mother from the hall below, "what are you doing all by yourself in that room?" Valency dropped Thistle Harvest like a hot cold and fled downstairs to her patches, but she felt the strange exhilaration of spirit that always came momentarily to her when she dipped into one of John Foster's books. Valency didn't know much about woods, except the haunted groves of oak and pine around her blue castle, but she had always secretly hankered after them, and a Foster book about woods was the next best thing to the woods themselves. At noon it stopped raining, but the sun did not come out until 3. Then Valency timidly said she thought she would go uptown. "What do you want to go uptown for?" demanded her mother. "I want to get a book from the library." "You got a book from the library only last week." "No, it was 4 weeks." "4 weeks? Nonsense." "Really it was, Mother." "You are mistaken. It cannot possibly have been more than 2 weeks. I dislike contradiction. And I do not see what you want to get a book for anyhow. You waste too much time reading." "Of what value is my time?" asked Valency bitterly. "Das, don't speak in that tone to me."
"We need some tea," said Cousin Stickles. "She might go and get that if she wants a walk, though this damp weather is bad for colds." They argued the matter for 10 minutes longer, and finally Mrs. Frederick agreed rather grudgingly that Valency might go. Chapter 4. "Got your rubbers on?" called Cousin Stickles as Valency left the house. Christine Stickles had never once forgotten to ask that question when Valency went out on a damp day. "Yes." "Have you got your flannel petticoat on?" asked Mrs. Frederick. "No." "Doss, I really do not understand you. Do you want to catch your death of cold again?" Her voice implied that Valency had died of a cold several times already. "Go upstairs this minute and put it on." "Mother, I don't need a flannel petticoat. My sateen one is warm enough." "Doss, remember you had bronchitis 2 years ago. Go and do as you are told." Valency went, though nobody will ever know just how near she came to hurling the rubber plant into the street before she went. She hated that grey flannel petticoat more than any other garment she owned. Olive never had to wear flannel petticoats. Olive wore ruffled silk and sheer lawn and filmy laced flounces. But Olive's father had married money, and Olive never had bronchitis. So there you were. "Are you sure you didn't leave the soap in the water?" demanded Mrs. Frederick. But Valency was gone. She turned at the corner and looked back down the ugly, prim, respectable street where she lived. The Sterling house was the ugliest on it, more like a red brick box than anything else, too high for its breadth, and made still higher by a bulbous glass cupola on top. About it was the desolate, barren piece of an old house whose life is lived. There was a very pretty little house, with leaded casements and dubbed gables, just round the corner, a new house, one of those houses you love the minute you see them. Clayton Markley had built it for his bride. He was to be married to Jenny Lloyd in June. The little house, it was said, was furnished from attic to cellar, in complete readiness for its mistress. I don't envy Jenny the man, thought Valency sincerely. Clayton Markley was not one of her many ideals, but I do envy her the house. It's such a nice young house. Oh, if I could only have a house of my own, ever so poor, so tiny, but my own. But then, she added bitterly, there is no use in yowling for the moon when you can't even get a tallow candle.
In dreamland, nothing would do Valency but a castle of pale sapphire. In real life, she would have been fully satisfied with a little house of her own. She envied Jenny Lloyd more fiercely than ever today. Jenny was not so much better looking than she was, and not so very much younger. Yet she was to have this delightful house, and the nicest little Wedgwood teacups, Valency had seen them, and open fireplace, and monogrammed linen, hem-stitched tablecloths and china closets. Why did everything come to some girls and nothing to others? It wasn't fair. Valency was once more seething with rebellion as she walked along, a prim, dowdy little figure in her shabby raincoat and 3-year-old hat, splashed occasionally by the mud of a passing motor with its insulting shrieks. Motors were still rather a novelty in Deerwood, though they were common in Port Lawrence, and most of the summer residents up at Muskoka had them. In Deerwood, only some of the smart set had them, for even Deerwood was divided into sets. There was the smart set, the intellectual set, the old family set, of which the Sterlings were members, the common run, and a few pariahs. Not one of the Sterling clan had as yet condescended to a motor, though Olive was teasing her father to have one. Valency had never even been in a motor car, but she did not hanker after this. In truth, she felt rather afraid of motor cars, especially at night. They seemed to be too much like big purring beasts that might turn and crush you, or make some terrible savage leap somewhere. On the steep mountain trails around her blue castle, only gaily caparisoned steeds might proudly pace. In real life, Valancy would have been quite contented to drive in a buggy behind a nice horse. She got a buggy drive only when some uncle or cousin remembered to fling her a chance, like a bone to a dog. Chapter 5. Of course, she must buy the tea in Uncle Benjamin's grocery store. To buy it anywhere else was unthinkable. Yet Valancy hated to go to Uncle Benjamin's store on her 29th birthday. There was no hope that he would not remember it. "Why," demanded Uncle Benjamin, leeringly, as he tied up her tea, "are young ladies like bad grammarians?" Valancy, with Uncle Benjamin's will in the background of her mind, said meekly, "I don't know. Why?" "Because," chuckled Uncle Benjamin, "they can't decline matrimony." The two clerks, Joe Hammond and Claude Bertram, chuckled also, and Valancy disliked them a little more than ever. On the first day Claude Bertram had seen her in the store, she had heard him whisper to Joe, "Who is that?" And Joe had said, "Valancy Sterling, one of the Deerwood old maids." "Curable or incurable?" Claude had asked with a snicker, evidently thinking the question very clever. Valancy smarted anew with the sting of that old recollection.
29, Uncle Benjamin was saying. "Dear me, Doss, you're dangerously near the second corner and not even thinking of getting married yet. 29. It seems impossible." Then Uncle Benjamin said an original thing. Uncle Benjamin said, "How time does fly." "I think it crawls," said Valancy passionately. Passion was so alien to Uncle Benjamin's conception of Valancy that he didn't know what to make of her. To cover his confusion, he asked another conundrum as he tied up her beans. Cousin Stickles had remembered at the last moment that they must have beans. Beans were cheap and filling. "What two ages are apt to prove illusory?" asked Uncle Benjamin. And not waiting for Valancy to give it up, he added, "Mirage and marriage." "Mirage is pronounced mirage," said Valancy shortly, picking up her tea and her beans. For the moment, she did not care whether Uncle Benjamin cut her out of his will or not. She walked out of the store while Uncle Benjamin stared after her with his mouth open. Then he shook his head. "Poor Doss is taking it hard," he said. Valancy was sorry by the time she reached the next crossing. Why had she lost her patience like that? Uncle Benjamin would be annoyed and would likely tell her mother that Doss had been impertinent to me, and her mother would lecture her for a week. "I've held my tongue for 20 years, thought Valancy. Why couldn't I have held it once more? Yes, it was just 20, Valancy reflected, since she had first been twitted with her loverless condition. She remembered the bitter moment perfectly. She was just 9 years old, and she was standing alone on the school playground, while the other little girls of her class were playing a game in which you must be chosen by a boy as his partner before you could play. Nobody had chosen Valancy, little, pale, black-haired Valancy, with her prim, long-sleeved apron and odd slanted eyes. "Oh," said a pretty little girl to her, "I'm so sorry for you. You haven't got a beau." Valancy had said defiantly, as she continued to say for 20 years, "I don't want a beau." But this afternoon, Valancy once and for all stopped saying that.
"I'm going to be honest with myself anyhow," she thought savagely. "Uncle Benjamin's riddles hurt me because they are true. I do want to be married. I want a house of my own. I want a husband of my own. I want sweet little fat babies of my own." Valancy stopped suddenly, aghast at her own recklessness. She felt sure that Reverend Dr. Stalling, who passed her at this moment, read her thoughts and disapproved of them thoroughly. Valancy was afraid of Dr. Stalling, had been afraid of him ever since the Sunday 23 years before when he had first come to St. Albans. Valancy had been too late for Sunday school that day, and she had gone into the church timidly and sat in their pew. No one else was in the church, nobody except the new rector, Dr. Stalling. Dr. Stalling stood up in front of the choir door, beckoned to her, and said sternly, "Little boy, come up here." Valancy had stared around her. There was no little boy. There was no one in all the huge church but herself. The blue glasses couldn't mean her. She was not a boy. "Little boy," repeated Dr. Stalling, more sternly still, shaking his forefinger fiercely at her. "Come up here at once." Valancy arose as if hypnotized and walked up the aisle. She was too terrified to do anything else. What dreadful thing was going to happen to her? What had happened to her? Had she actually turned into a boy? She came to a stop in front of Dr. Stalling. Dr. Stalling shaked his forefinger, such a long, knuckly forefinger, at her and said, "Little boy, take off your hat." Valancy took off her hat. She had a scrawny little pigtail hanging down her back, but Dr. Stalling was short-sighted and did not perceive it. "Little boy, go back to your seat and always take off your hat in church, remember." Valancy went back to her seat, carrying her hat like an automaton. Presently her mother came in. "Doss," said Mrs. Sterling, "what do you mean by taking off your hat? Put it on instantly." Valancy put it on instantly. She was cold with fear lest Dr. Stalling should immediately summon her up front again. She would have to go, of course. It never occurred to her that one could disobey the rector, and the church was full of people now. Oh, what would she do if that horrible stabbing forefinger were shaken at her again before all those people? Valancy sat through the whole service in an agony of dread and was sick for a week afterwards. Nobody knew why. Mrs. Frederick again bemoaned herself of her delicate child. Dr. Stalling found out his mistake and laughed over it to Valancy, who did not laugh. She never got over her dread of Dr. Stalling. And now to be caught by him on the street corner, thinking such things.
Valancy got her John Foster book, Magic of Wings, his latest, all about birds, said Miss Clarkson. She had almost decided that she would go home instead of going to see Dr. Trent. Her courage had failed her. She was afraid of offending Uncle James, afraid of angering her mother, afraid of facing gruff, shaggy-browed old Dr. Trent, who would probably tell her, as he had told Cousin Gladys, that her trouble was entirely imaginary and that she only had it because she liked to have it. No, she would not go. She would get a bottle of Redfern's purple pills instead. Redfern's purple pills were the standard medicine of the Sterling clan. Had they not cured second cousin Geraldine when 5 doctors had given her up? Valancy always felt very skeptical concerning the virtues of the purple pills, but there might be something in them, and it was easier to take them than to face Dr. Trent alone. She would glance over the magazines in the reading room a few minutes and then go home. Valancy tried to read a story, but it made her furious. On every page was a picture of the heroine surrounded by adoring men. And here was she, Valancy Sterling, who could not get a solitary beau. Valancy slammed the magazine shut. She opened Magic of Wings. Her eyes fell on the paragraph that changed her life. "Fear is the original sin," wrote John Foster. "Almost all the evil in the world has its origin in the fact that someone is afraid of something. It is a cold, slimy serpent coiling about you. It is horrible to live with fear, and it is of all things degrading." Valancy shut Magic of Wings and stood up. She would go and see Dr. Trent. Chapter 6. The ordeal was not so dreadful after all. Dr. Trent was as gruff and abrupt as usual, but he did not tell her her ailment was imaginary. After he had listened to her symptoms and asked a few questions and made a quick examination, he sat for a moment looking at her quite intently. Valancy thought he looked as if he were sorry for her. She caught her breath for a moment. Was the trouble serious? Oh, it couldn't be, surely. It really hadn't bothered her much, only lately it had got a little worse. Dr. Trent opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the telephone at his elbow rang sharply. He picked up the receiver. Valancy, watching him, saw his face change suddenly as he listened. "Lo? Yes? Yes? What? Yes? Yes?" A brief interval. My God. Dr. Trent dropped the receiver, dashed out of the room and upstairs without even a glance at Valancy. She heard him rushing madly about overhead, barking out a few remarks to somebody, presumably his housekeeper. Then he came tearing downstairs with a club bag in his hand, snatched his hat and coat from the rack, jerked open the street door, and rushed down the street in the direction of the station.
Valancy sat alone in the little office, feeling more absolutely foolish than she had ever felt before in her life. Foolish and humiliated. So this was all that had come of her heroic determination to live up to John Foster and cast fear aside. Not only was she a failure as a relative and non-existent as a sweetheart or friend, but she was not even of any importance as a patient. Dr. Trent had forgotten her very presence in his excitement over whatever message had come by the telephone. She had gained nothing by ignoring Uncle James and flying in the face of family tradition. For a moment she was afraid she was going to cry. It was all so ridiculous. Then she heard Dr. Trent's housekeeper coming down the stairs. Valancy rose and went to the office door. "The doctor forgot all about me," she said with a twisted smile. "Well, that's too bad," said Mrs. Patterson sympathetically. "But it wasn't much wonder, poor man. That was a telegram they phoned over from the port. His son has been terribly injured in an auto accident in Montreal. The doctor had just 10 minutes to catch the train. I don't know what he'll do if anything happens to Ned. He's just bound up in the boy. You'll have to come again, Miss Sterling. I hope it's nothing serious." "Oh, no, nothing serious," agreed Valancy. She felt a little less humiliated. It was no wonder poor Dr. Trent had forgotten her at such a moment.
Nevertheless, she felt very flat and discouraged as she went down the street. Valancy went home by the shortcut of Lover's Lane. She did not often go through Lover's Lane, but it was getting near supper time, and it would never do to be late. Lover's Lane wound back of the village, under great elms and maples, and deserved its name. It was hard to go there at any time and not find some canoodling couple or young girls in pairs, arms intertwined, earnestly talking over their little secrets. Valancy didn't know which made her feel more self-conscious and uncomfortable. This evening she encountered both. She met Connie Hale and Kate Bailey in new pink organdy dresses with flowers stuck coquettishly in their glossy bare hair. Valancy had never had a pink dress or worn flowers in her hair. Then she passed a young couple she didn't know, dandering along, oblivious to everything but themselves. The young man's arm was around the girl's waist, quite shamelessly. Valancy had never walked with a man's arm around her. She felt that she ought to be shocked. They might leave that sort of thing for the screening twilight at least, but she wasn't shocked. In another flash of desperate, stark honesty, she owned to herself that she was merely envious. When she passed them, she felt quite sure they were laughing at her, pitying her. There's that queer little old maid, Valancy Sterling. They say she never had a beau in her whole life. Valancy fairly ran to get out of Lover's Lane. Never had she felt so utterly colorless and skinny and insignificant.
Just where Lover's Lane debauched on the street, an old car was parked. Valancy knew that car well, by sound at least, and everybody in Deerwood knew it. This was before the phrase Tin Lizzie had come into circulation, in Deerwood at least. But if it had been known, this car was the tinniest of Lizzies, though it was not a Ford, but an old grey Slosson. Nothing more battered and disreputable could be imagined. It was Barney Snaith's car, and Barney himself was just scrambling up from under it, in overalls plastered with mud. Valancy gave him a swift, furtive look as she hurried by. This was only the second time she had ever seen the notorious Barney Snaith, though she had heard enough about him in the 5 years that he had been living up back in Muskoka. The first time had been nearly a year ago, on the Muskoka Road. He had been crawling out from under his car then, too, and he had given her a cheerful grin as she went by, a little whimsical grin that gave him the look of an amused gnome. He didn't look bad. She didn't believe he was bad, in spite of the wild yarns that were always being told of him. Of course he went tearing in that terrible old grey Slosson through Deerwood at hours when all decent people were in bed, often with old roaring Abel who made the night hideous with his howls, both of them dead drunk, my dear. And everyone knew that he was an escaped convict, and a defaulting bank clerk, and a murderer in hiding, and an infidel, and an illegitimate son of old Roaring Abel Gay, and the father of Roaring Abel's illegitimate grandchild, and a counterfeiter, and a forger, and a few other awful things. But still, Valancy didn't believe he was bad. Nobody with a smile like that could be bad, no matter what he had done. It was that night the Prince of the Blue Castle changed from a being of grim jaw and hair with a dash of premature grey to a rakish individual with overlong tawny hair, dashed with red, dark brown eyes, and ears that stuck out just enough to give him an alert look, but not enough to be called flying jibs. But he still retained something a little grim about the jaw.
Barney Snaith looked even more disreputable than usual just now. It was very evident that he hadn't shaved for days, and his hands and arms, bare to the shoulders, were black with grease. But he was whistling gleefully to himself, and he seemed so happy that Valancy envied him. She envied him his light-heartedness and his irresponsibility, and his mysterious little cabin up on an island in Lake Mistawis, even his rackety old grey Slosson. Neither he nor his car had to be respectable and live up to traditions. When he rattled past her a few minutes later, bareheaded, leaning back in his Lizzie at a raffish angle, his longish hair blowing in the wind, a villainous-looking old black pipe in his mouth, she envied him again. Men had the best of it, no doubt about that. This outlaw was happy, whatever he was or wasn't. She, Valancy Sterling, respectable, well-behaved to the last degree, was unhappy and had always been unhappy. So there you were. Valancy was just in time for supper. The sun had clouded over, and a dismal, drizzling rain was falling again. Cousin Stickles had the neuralgia. Valancy had to do the family darning, and there was no time for magic of wings. "Can't the darning wait till tomorrow?" she pleaded. "Tomorrow will bring its own duties," said Mrs. Frederick inexorably. Valancy darned all the evening and listened to Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles talking the eternal, niggling gossip of the clan as they knitted drearily at interminable black stockings. They discussed Second Cousin Lillian's approaching wedding in all its bearings. On the whole, they approved. Second Cousin Lillian was doing well for herself. "Though she hasn't hurried," said Cousin Stickles. "She must be 25. "There have not, fortunately, been many old maids in our connection," said Mrs. Frederick bitterly. Valancy flinched. She had run the darning needle into her finger. Third cousin Aaron Gray had been scratched by a cat and had blood poisoning in his finger. Cats are most dangerous animals, said Mrs. Frederick. I would never have a cat about the house. She glared significantly at Valancy through her terrible glasses. Once 5 years ago, Valancy had asked if she might have a cat. She had never referred to it since, but Mrs. Frederick still suspected her of harboring the unlawful desire in her heart of hearts. Once Valancy sneezed. Now, in the Sterling Code, it was very bad form to sneeze in public. You can always repress a sneeze by pressing your finger on your upper lip, said Mrs. Frederick rebukingly.
9:30, and so, as Mr. Peepies would say, to bed. But first Cousin Stickles' neurologic back must be rubbed with Redfern's liniment. Valancy did that. Valancy always had to do it. She hated the smell of Redfern's liniment. She hated the smug, beaming, portly, bewhiskered, bespectacled picture of Dr. Redfern on the bottle. Her fingers smelled of the horrible stuff after she got into bed, in spite of all the scrubbing she gave them. Valancy's day of destiny had come and gone. She ended it as she had begun it, in tears. Chapter 7. There was a rose bush on the little Sterling lawn growing beside the gate. It was called Doss's rose bush. Cousin Georgiana had given it to Valancy 5 years ago, and Valancy had planted it joyfully. She loved roses. But, of course, the rose bush never bloomed. That was her luck. Valancy did everything she could think of and took the advice of everybody in the clan. But still the rosebush would not bloom. It throve and grew luxuriantly, with great leafy branches untouched of rust or spider, but not even a bud had ever appeared on it. Valancy, looking at it 2 days after her birthday, was filled with a sudden, overwhelming hatred for it. The thing wouldn't bloom. Very well then, she would cut it down. She marched to the tool room in the barn for her garden knife, and she went at the rosebush viciously. A few minutes later, horrified Mrs. Frederick came out to the veranda and beheld her daughter slashing insanely among the rosebush boughs. Half of them were already strewn on the walk. The bush looked sadly dismantled. "Doss, what on earth are you doing? Have you gone crazy?" "No," said Valancy. She meant to say it defiantly, but habit was too strong for her. She said it deprecatingly. I just made up my mind to cut this bush down. It is no good. It never blooms, never will bloom." "That is no reason for destroying it," said Mrs. Frederick sternly. "It was a beautiful bush and quite ornamental. You have made a sorry-looking thing of it." "Rose trees should bloom," said Valancy a little obstinately. "Don't argue with me, Doss. Clear up that mess and leave the bush alone. I don't know what Georgiana will say when she sees how you have hacked it to pieces. Really, I'm surprised at you, and to do it without consulting me." "The bush is mine," muttered Valancy. "What's that? What did you say, Doss?" "I only said the bush was mine," repeated Valancy humbly. Mrs. Frederick turned without a word and marched back into the house. The mischief was done now. Valancy knew she had offended her mother deeply and would not be spoken to or noticed in any way for 2 or 3 days. Cousin Stickles would see to Valancy's binning up, but Mrs. Frederick would preserve the stony silence of outraged majesty. Valancy sighed and put away her garden knife, hanging it precisely on its precise nail in the tool shop. She cleared away the severed branches and swept up the leaves. Her lips twitched as she looked at the straggling bush. It had an odd resemblance to its shaken, scrawny donor, little cousin Georgiana herself. "I certainly have made an awful-looking thing of it," thought Valancy. But she did not feel repentant, only sorry she had offended her mother. Things would be so uncomfortable until she was forgiven. Mrs. Frederick was one of those women who can make their anger felt all over a house. Walls and doors are no protection from it. "You'd better go uptown and get the mail," said Cousin Stickles when Valancy went in. "I can't go. I feel all sort of peaky and piney this spring. I want you to stop at the drugstore and get me a bottle of Redfern's blood bitters. There's nothing like Redfern's bitters for building a body up. Cousin James says the purple pills are the best, but I know better. My poor dear husband took Redfern's bitters right up to the day he died. Don't let them charge you more than 90 cents. I can get it for that at the port. And what have you been saying to your poor mother? Do you ever stop to think, Doss, that you can only have one mother?" "One is enough for me," thought Valancy undutifully as she went uptown. She got Cousin Stickles' bottle of bitters, and then she went to the post office and asked for her mail at the general delivery. Her mother did not have a box. They got too little mail to bother with it. Valancy did not expect any mail, except the Christian Times, which was the only paper they took. They hardly ever got any letters. But Valancy rather liked to stand in the office and watch Mr. Carew, the gray-bearded, Santa Clausy old clerk, handing out letters to the lucky people who did get them. He did it with such a detached, impersonal, Jove-like air,
as if it did not matter in the least to him what supernal joys or shattering horrors might be in those letters for the people to whom they were addressed. Letters had a fascination for Valancy, perhaps because she so seldom got any. In her blue castle, exciting epistles bound with silk and sealed with crimson were always being brought to her by pages in livery of gold and blue, but in real life her only letters were occasional perfunctory notes from relatives or an advertising circular. Consequently, she was immensely surprised when Mr. Carew, looking even more Jovian than usual, poked a letter out to her. Yes, it was addressed to her plainly in a fierce black hand, Miss Valancy Sterling, Elm Street, Deerwood, and the postmark was Montreal. Valancy picked it up with a little quickening of her breath. Montreal! It must be from Dr. Trent. He had remembered her after all. Valancy met Uncle Benjamin coming in as she was going out, and was glad the letter was safely in her bag.
"What," said Uncle Benjamin, "is the difference between a donkey and a postage stamp?" "I don't know. What?" answered Valancy dutifully. "One you lick with a stick, and the other you stick with a lick. Ha ha." Uncle Benjamin passed in, tremendously pleased with himself. Cousin Stickles pounced on the Times when Valancy got home, but it did not occur to her to ask if there were any letters. Mrs. Frederick would have asked it, but Mrs. Frederick's lips at present were sealed. Valancy was glad of this. If her mother had asked if there were any letters, Valancy would have had to admit there was. Then she would have had to let her mother and Cousin Stickles read the letter, and all would be discovered. Her heart acted strangely on the way upstairs, and she sat down by her window for a few minutes before opening her letter. She felt very guilty and deceitful. She had never before kept a letter secret from her mother. Every letter she had ever written or received had been read by Mrs. Frederick. That had never mattered. Valancy had never had anything to hide. But this did matter. She could not have anyone see this letter. But her fingers trembled with a consciousness of wickedness and unfilial conduct as she opened it, trembled a little too, perhaps, with apprehension. She felt quite sure there was nothing seriously wrong with her heart, but one never knew. Dr. Trent's letter was like himself, blunt, abrupt, concise, wasting no words. Dr. Trent never beat about the bush. "Dear Miss Sterling," and then a page of black positive writing. Valancy seemed to read it at a glance. She dropped it on her lap, her face ghost white. Dr. Trent told her that she had a very dangerous and fatal form of heart disease, angina pectoris, evidently complicated with an aneurysm, whatever that was, and in the last stages. He said, without mincing matters, that nothing could be done for her. If she took great care of herself, she might live a year, but she might also die at any moment. Dr. Trent never troubled himself about euphemisms. She must be careful to avoid all excitement and all severe muscular efforts. She must eat and drink moderately, she must never run, she must go upstairs and uphill with great care. Any sudden jolt or shock might be fatal. She was to get the prescription she enclosed filled and carry it with her always, taking a dose whenever her attacks came on. And he was hers truly, H.B. Trent. Valancy sat for a long while by her window. Outside was a world drowned in the light of a spring afternoon, skies entrancingly blue, winds perfumed and free, lovely soft blue hazes at the end of every street. Over at the railway station a group of young girls was waiting for a train. She heard their gay laughter as they chatted and joked. The train roared in and roared out again. But none of these things had any reality. Nothing had any reality except the fact that she had only another year to live.
When she was tired of sitting at the window, she went over and lay down on her bed, staring at the cracked, discolored ceiling. The curious numbness that follows on a staggering blow possessed her. She did not feel anything except a boundless surprise and incredulity, behind which was the conviction that Dr. Trent knew his business and that she, Valancy Sterling, who had never lived, was about to die. When the gong rang for supper, Valancy got up and went downstairs mechanically, from force of habit. She wondered that she had been let alone so long. But of course, her mother would not pay any attention to her just now. Valancy was thankful for this. She thought the quarrel over the rosebush had been really, as Mrs. Frederick herself might have said, providential. She could not eat anything, but both Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles thought this was because she was deservedly unhappy over her mother's attitude, and her lack of appetite was not commented on. Valancy forced herself to swallow a cup of tea, and then sat and watched the others eat, with an odd feeling that years had passed since she had sat with them at the dinner table. She found herself smiling inwardly to think what a commotion she could make if she chose. Let her merely tell them what was in Dr. Trent's letter, and there would be as much fuss made as if, Valancy thought bitterly, they really cared 2 straws about her. Dr. Trent's housekeeper got word from him today, said Cousin Stickles, so suddenly that Valancy jumped guiltily. Was there anything in thought waves? Mrs. Judd was talking to her uptown. They think his son will recover, but Dr. Trent wrote that if he did, he was going to take him abroad as soon as he was able to travel, and won't be back here for a year at least. That will not matter much to us, said Mrs. Frederick majestically. He is not our doctor. I would not, here she looked or seemed to look accusingly right through Valancy, have him to doctor a sick cat. May I go upstairs and lie down? Said Valancy faintly. I have a headache. What has given you a headache? Asked Cousin Stickles, since Mrs. Frederick would not. The question had to be asked. Valancy could not be allowed to have headaches without interference. You ain't in the habit of having headaches. I hope you're not taking the mumps. Here, try a spoonful of vinegar. Piffle, said Valancy rudely, getting up from the table. She didn't care just then if she were rude. She had had to be so polite all her life. If it had been possible for Cousin Stickles to turn pale, she would have. As it was not, she turned yellower. Are you sure you ain't feverish, Doss? You sound like it. You go and get right into bed, said Cousin Stickles, thoroughly alarmed, and I'll come up and rub your forehead and the back of your neck with Redfern's liniment. Valancy had reached the door, but she turned. I won't be rubbed with Redfern's liniment, she said. Cousin Stickles stared and gasped. What do you mean? I said I wouldn't be rubbed with Redfern's liniment, repeated Valancy. Horrid sticky stuff, and it has the vilest smell of any liniment I ever saw. It's no good. I want to be left alone, that's all. Valancy went out, leaving Cousin Stickles aghast. She's feverish. She must be feverish, ejaculated Cousin Stickles. Mrs. Frederick went on eating her supper. It did not matter whether Valancy was or was not feverish. Valancy had been guilty of impertinence to her. Chapter 8. Valancy did not sleep that night. She lay awake all through the long, dark hours, thinking. She made a discovery that surprised her. She, who had been afraid of almost everything in life, was not afraid of death. It did not seem in the least terrible to her, and she need not now be afraid of anything else. Why had she been afraid of things? Because of life. Afraid of Uncle Benjamin because of the menace of poverty and old age. But now she would never be old, neglected, tolerated. Afraid of being an old maid all her life. But now she would not be an old maid very long. Afraid of offending her mother and her clan because she had to live with and among them and couldn't live peaceably if she didn't give in to them. But now she hadn't. Valancy felt a curious freedom, but she was still horribly afraid of one thing, the fuss the whole jam-fry of them would make when she told them. Valancy shuddered at the thought of it. She couldn't endure it. Oh, she knew so well how it would be. First, there would be indignation. Yes, indignation on the part of Uncle James because she had gone to a doctor. Any doctor, without consulting him. Indignation on the part of her mother for being so sly and deceitful. To your own mother, Doss. Indignation on the part of the whole clan because she had not gone to Dr. Marsh.
Then would come the solicitude. She would be taken to Dr. Marsh, and when Dr. Marsh confirmed Dr. Trent's diagnosis, she would be taken to specialists in Toronto and Montreal. Uncle Benjamin would foot the bill with a splendid gesture of munificence in thus assisting the widow and orphan, and talk forever after of the shocking fees specialists charged for looking wise and saying they couldn't do anything. And when the specialists could do nothing for her, Uncle James would insist on her taking purple pills. I've known them to effect a cure when all the doctors had given up. And her mother would insist on Redfern's blood bitters, and Cousin Stickles would insist on rubbing her over the heart every night with Redfern's liniment, on the grounds that it might do good and couldn't do harm, and everybody else would have some pet dope for her to take. Dr. Stalling would come to her and say solemnly, "You are very ill. Are you prepared for what may be before you?" Almost as if he were going to shake his forefinger at her, the forefinger that had not grown any shorter or less knobbly with age. And she would be watched and checked like a baby and never let do anything or go anywhere alone. Perhaps she would not even be allowed to sleep alone lest she die in her sleep. Cousin Stickles or her mother would insist on sharing her room and bed. Yes, undoubtedly they would.
It was this last thought that really decided Valancy. She could not put up with it, and she wouldn't. As the clock in the hall below struck 12, Valancy suddenly and definitely made up her mind that she would not tell anybody. She had always been told, ever since she could remember, that she must hide her feelings. It is not ladylike to have feelings, Cousin Stickles had once told her disapprovingly. Well, she would hide them with a vengeance. But though she was not afraid of death, she was not indifferent to it. She found that she resented it. It was not fair that she should have to die when she had never lived. Rebellion flamed up in her soul as the dark hours passed by, not because she had no future, but because she had no past. I'm poor, I'm ugly, I'm a failure, and I'm near death, she thought. She could see her own obituary notice in the Deerwood Weekly Times, copied into the Port Lawrence Journal. A deep gloom was cast over Deerwood, etc., etc. Leaves a large circle of friends to mourn, etc., etc. Lies, all lies. Gloom, forsooth. Nobody would miss her. Her death would not matter a straw to anybody. Not even her mother loved her. Her mother who had been so disappointed that she was not a boy, or at least a pretty girl. Valancy reviewed her whole life between midnight and the early spring dawn. It was a very drab existence, but here and there an incident loomed out with a significance out of all proportion to its real importance. These incidents were all unpleasant in one way or another. Nothing really pleasant had ever happened to Valancy.
I've never had one wholly happy hour in my life. Not one, she thought. I've just been a colourless nonentity. I remember reading somewhere once that there is an hour in which a woman might be happy all her life if she could but find it. I've never found my hour. Never, never. And I never will now. If I could only have had that hour, I'd be willing to die. Those significant incidents kept bobbing up in her mind like unbidden ghosts, without any sequence of time or place. For instance, that time when, at 16, she had blued a tub full of clothes too deeply, and the time when, at 8, she had stolen some raspberry jam from Aunt Wellington's pantry. Valancy never heard the last of those two misdemeanors. At almost every clan gathering they were raked up against her as jokes. Uncle Benjamin hardly ever missed retelling the raspberry jam incident. He had been the one to catch her, her face all stained and streaked. I have really done so few bad things that they have to keep harping on the old ones, thought Valancy. Why, I've never even had a quarrel with anyone. I haven't an enemy. What a spineless thing I must be not to have even one enemy. There was that incident of the dust pile at school when she was 7. Valancy always recalled it when Dr. Stalling referred to the text, "To him that hath shall be given, and from him that hath not shall be taken even that which he hath." Other people might puzzle over that text, but it never puzzled Valancy. The whole relationship between herself and Olive, dating from the day of the dust pile, was a commentary on it. She had been going to school a year, but Olive, who was a year younger, had just begun, and had about her all the glamour of a new girl, and an exceedingly pretty girl at that. It was at recess, and all the girls, big and little, were out on the road in front of the school making dust piles. The aim of each girl was to have the biggest pile. Valancy was good at making dust piles. There was an art in it, and she had secret hopes of leading. But Olive, working off by herself, was suddenly discovered to have a larger dust pile than anybody. Valancy felt no jealousy. Her dust pile was quite big enough to please her. Then one of the older girls had an inspiration. "Let's put all our dust on Olive's pile and make a tremendous one," she exclaimed. A frenzy seemed to seize the girls. They swooped down on the dust piles with pails and shovels, and in a few seconds Olive's pile was a veritable pyramid. In vain Valancy, with scrawny, outstretched little arms, tried to protect hers. She was ruthlessly swept aside, her dust pile scooped up and pulled on Olive's. Valancy turned away resolutely and began building another dust pile. Again, a bigger girl pounced on it. Valancy stood before it, flushed, indignant, palms outspread. "Don't take it," she pleaded. "Please don't take it." "But why?" demanded the older girl. "Why won't you help to build Olive's bigger?"
"I want my own little dust pile," said Valancy piteously. Her plea went unheeded. While she argued with one girl, another scraped up her dust pile. Valancy turned away, her heart swelling, her eyes full of tears. "Jealous, you're jealous," said the girls mockingly. "You are very selfish," said her mother coldly when Valancy told her about it at night.
That was the first and last time Valancy had ever taken any of her troubles to a mother. Valancy was neither jealous nor selfish. It was only that she wanted a dust pile of her own. Small or big mattered not. A team of horses came down the street. Olive's dust pile was scattered over the roadway. The bell rang. The girls trooped into school and had forgotten the whole affair before they reached their seats. Valancy never forgot it. To this day she resented it in her secret soul. But was it not symbolical of her life? I've never been able to have my own dust pile, thought Valancy. The enormous red moon she had seen rising right at the end of the street one autumn evening of her 6th year. She had been sick and cold with the awful, uncanny horror of it, so near to her, so big. She had run in trembling to her mother, and her mother had laughed at her. She had gone to bed and hidden her face under the clothes in terror lest she might look at the window and see that horrible moon glaring in at her through it. The boy who had tried to kiss her at a party when she was 15. She had not let him. She had evaded him and run. He was the only boy who had ever tried to kiss her. Now, 14 years later, Valancy found herself wishing that she had let him. The time she had been made to apologize to Olive for something she hadn't done. Olive had said that Valancy had pushed her into the mud and spoiled her new shoes on purpose. Valancy knew she hadn't. It had been an accident, and even that wasn't her fault. But nobody would believe her. She had to apologize and kiss Olive to make up. The injustice of it burned in her soul tonight. That summer when Olive had the most beautiful hat, trimmed with creamy yellow net, with a wreath of red roses and little ribbon bows under the chin, Valancy had wanted a hat like that more than she had ever wanted anything. She pleaded for one and had been laughed at. All summer she had to wear a horrid little brown sailor with elastic that cut behind her ears. None of the girls would go around with her because she was so shabby. Nobody but Olive. People had thought Olive so sweet and unselfish. I was an excellent foil for her, thought Valancy. Even then she knew that. Valancy had tried to win a prize for attendance in Sunday school once, but Olive won it. There were so many Sundays Valancy had to stay home because she had colds. She had once tried to say a piece in school one Friday afternoon and had broken down in it. Olive was a good reciter and never got stuck.
The night she had spent in Port Lawrence with Aunt Isabel when she was 10. Byron Sterling was there, from Montreal, 12 years old, conceited, clever. At Kennelly prayers in the morning, Byron had reached across and given Valancy's thin arms such a savage pinch that she screamed out with pain. After prayers were over, she was summoned to Aunt Isabel's bar of judgment. But when she said Byron had pinched her, Byron denied it. He said she cried out because the kitten scratched her. He said she had put the kitten up on her chair and was playing with it when she should have been listening to Uncle David's prayer. He was believed. In the Sterling clan, the boys were always believed before the girls. Valancy was sent home in disgrace because of her exceedingly bad behavior during family prayers, and she was not asked to Aunt Isabel's again for many moons. The time Cousin Betty Sterling was married, somehow Valancy got wind of the fact that Betty was going to ask her to be one of her bridesmaids. Valancy was secretly uplifted. It would be a delightful thing to be a bridesmaid, and of course she would have to have a new dress for it. A pretty new dress, a pink dress. Betty wanted her bridesmaids to dress in pink. But Betty had never asked her, after all. Valancy couldn't guess why, but long after her secret tears of disappointment had been dried, Olive told her. Betty, after much consultation and reflection, had decided that Valancy was too insignificant. She would spoil the effect. That was 9 years ago. But tonight, Valancy caught her breath with the old pain and sting of it. That day in her 11th year, when her mother had badgered her into confessing something she had never done, Valancy had denied it for a long time, but eventually, for peace sake, she had given in and pleaded guilty. Mrs. Frederick was always making people lie by pushing them into situations where they had to lie. Then her mother had made her kneel down on the parlor floor between herself and Cousin Stickles and say, "Oh God, please forgive me for not speaking the truth." Valancy had said it, but as she rose from her knees, she muttered, "But, oh God, you know I did speak the truth." Valancy had not then heard of Galileo, but her fate was similar to his. She was punished just as severely as if she hadn't confessed and prayed. The winter she went to dancing school. Uncle James had decreed she should go and had paid for her lessons. How she had looked forward to it, and how she had hated it. She had never had a voluntary partner. The teacher always had to tell some boy to dance with her, and generally he had been sulky about it. Yet Valancy was a good dancer, as light on her feet as thistledown.
Olive, who never lacked eager partners, was heavy.
The affair of the button string when she was 10. All the girls in school had button strings. Olive had a very long one with a great many beautiful buttons. Valancy had one. Most of the buttons on it were very commonplace, but she had 6 beauties that had come off Grandmother Sterling's wedding gown, sparkling buttons of gold and glass, much more beautiful than any Olive had. Their possession conferred a certain distinction on Valancy. She knew every little girl in school envied her the exclusive possession of those beautiful buttons. When Olive saw them on the button string, she had looked at them narrowly, but said nothing then. The next day, Aunt Wellington had come to Elm Street and told Mrs. Frederick that she thought Olive should have some of those buttons. Grandmother Sterling was just as much Wellington's mother as Frederick's. Mrs. Frederick had agreed amiably. She could not afford to fall out with Aunt Wellington. Moreover, the matter was of no importance whatever. Aunt Wellington carried all 4 of the buttons, generously leaving 2 for Valancy. Valancy had torn these from her string and flung them on the floor. She had not yet learned that it was unladylike to have feelings, and had been sent supperless to bed for the exhibition. The night of Margaret Blunt's party. She had made such pathetic efforts to be pretty that night. Rob Walker was to be there, and 2 nights before, on the moonlit veranda of Uncle Herbert's cottage at Miss Towis, Rob had really seemed attracted to her. At Margaret's party, Rob never even asked her to dance, did not notice her at all. She was a wallflower, as usual. That, of course, was years ago. People in Deerwood had long since given up inviting Valancy to dances. But to Valancy, its humiliation and disappointment were of the other day. Her face burned in the darkness as she recalled herself, sitting there with her pitifully crimped thin hair and the cheeks she had pinched for an hour before coming in an effort to make them red. All that came of it was a wild story that Valancy Sterling was rouged at Margaret Blunt's party. In those days in Deerwood, that was enough to wreck your character forever. It did not wreck Valancy's or even damage it. People knew she couldn't be fast if she tried. They only laughed at her. I've had nothing but a second-hand existence, decided Valancy. All the great emotions of life have passed me by. I've never even had a grief. And have I ever really loved anybody? Do I really love Mother? No, I don't. That's the truth, whether it is disgraceful or not. I don't love her. I've never loved her. What's worse, I don't even like her. So I don't know anything about any kind of love. My life has been empty. Nothing is worse than emptiness. Nothing. Valancy ejaculated the last nothing aloud passionately. Then she moaned and stopped thinking about anything for a while. One of her attacks of pain had come on.
When it was over, something had happened to Valancy, perhaps the culmination of the process that had been going on in her mind ever since she had read Dr. Trent's letter. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, the wisest and most accursed hour of the clock, but sometimes it sets us free. "I've been trying to please other people all my life and failed," she said. "After this I shall please myself. I shall never pretend anything again. I've breathed an atmosphere of fibs and pretenses and evasions all my life. What a luxury it will be to tell the truth. I may not be able to do much that I want to do, but I won't do another thing that I don't want to do. Mother can pout for weeks. I shan't worry over it. Despair is a free man. Hope is a slave." Valancy got up and dressed, with a deepening of that curious sense of freedom. When she had finished with her hair, she opened the window and hurled the jar of potpourri over into the next lot. It smashed gloriously against the schoolgirl complexion on the old carriage shop. "I'm sick of the fragrance of dead things," said Valancy. Chapter 9. Uncle Herbert and Aunt Alberta's silver wedding was delicately referred to among the Sterlings during the following weeks as the time we first noticed poor Valancy was a little, you understand. Not for worlds would any of the Sterlings have said out and out at first that Valancy had gone mildly insane, or even that her mind was slightly deranged. Uncle Benjamin was considered to have gone entirely too far when he had ejaculated, "She's dippy, I tell you she's dippy," and was only excused because of the outrageousness of Valancy's conduct at the aforesaid wedding dinner. But Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles had noticed a few things that made them uneasy before the dinner. It had begun with the rosebush, of course, and Valancy never was really quite right again.
She did not seem to worry in the least over the fact that her mother was not speaking to her. You would never suppose she noticed it at all. She had flatly refused to take either purple pills or Redfern's bitters. She had announced coolly that she did not intend to answer to the name of Doss any longer. She had told Cousin Stickles that she wished she would give up wearing that brooch with Cousin Artemis Stickles' hair in it. She had moved her bed in her room to the opposite corner. She had read Magic of Wings Sunday afternoon. When Cousin Stickles had rebuked her, Valancy had said indifferently, "Oh, I forgot it was Sunday," and had gone on reading it. Cousin Stickles had seen a terrible thing. She had caught Valancy sliding down the banister. Cousin Stickles did not tell Mrs. Frederick this. Poor Amelia was worried enough as it was. But it was Valancy's announcement on Saturday night that she was not going to go to the Anglican church anymore that broke through Mrs. Frederick's stony silence. Not going to church anymore. Doss, have you absolutely taken leave?
"Oh, I'm going to church," said Valancy airily. "I'm going to the Presbyterian church. But to the Anglican church, I will not go." This was even worse. Mrs. Frederick had recourse to tears, having found outraged majesty had ceased to be effective. "What have you got against the Anglican church?" she sobbed. "Nothing, only just that you've always made me go there. If you'd made me go to the Presbyterian church, I'd want to go to the Anglican. Is that a nice thing to say to your mother? Oh, how true it is that it is sharper than a serpent's tooth to have a thankless child. Is that a nice thing to say to your daughter?" said unrepentant Valancy. So Valancy's behavior at the silver wedding was not quite the surprise to Mrs. Frederick and Christine Stickles that it was to the rest. They were doubtful about the wisdom of taking her, but concluded it would make talk if they didn't. Perhaps she would behave herself, and so far no outsider suspected there was anything queer about her. By a special mercy of Providence, it had poured torrents Sunday morning, so Valancy had not carried out her hideous threat of going to the Presbyterian church. Valancy would not have cared in the least if they had left her at home. These family celebrations were all hopelessly dull. But the Sterlings always celebrated everything. It was a long-established custom. Even Mrs. Frederick gave a dinner party on her wedding anniversary, and Cousin Stickles had friends in to supper on her birthday. Valancy hated these entertainments because they had to pinch and save and contrive for weeks afterwards to pay for them. But she wanted to go to the silver wedding. It would hurt Uncle Herbert's feelings if she stayed away, and she rather liked Uncle Herbert. Besides, she wanted to look over all her relatives from her new angle. It would be an excellent place to make public her Declaration of Independence if occasion offered. "Put on your brown silk dress," said Mrs. Sterling.
As if there were anything else to put on. Valancy had only the one festive dress, that snuffy brown silk Aunt Isabel had given her. Aunt Isabel had decreed that Valancy should never wear colors. They did not become her. When she was young, they allowed her to wear white, but that had been tacitly dropped for some years. Valancy put on the brown silk. It had a high collar and long sleeves. She had never had a dress with low neck and elbow sleeves, although they had been worn, even in Deerwood, for over a year. But she did not do her hair pompadour. She knotted it on her neck and pulled it out over her ears. She thought it became her, only the little knot was so absurdly small. Mrs. Frederick resented the hair, but decided it was wisest to say nothing on the eve of the party. It was so important that Valancy should be kept in good humor, if possible, until it was over. Mrs. Frederick did not reflect that this was the first time in her life that she had thought it necessary to consider Valancy's humors. But then Valancy had never been queer before. On their way to Uncle Herbert's, Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles walking in front, Valancy trotting meekly along behind. Roaring Abel drove past them, drunk as usual, but not in the roaring stage, just drunk enough to be excessively polite. He raised his disreputable old tartan cap with the air of a monarch saluting his subjects and swept them a grand bow. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles dared not cut Roaring Abel altogether. He was the only person in Deerwood who could be got to do odd jobs of carpentering and repairing when they needed to be done, so it would not do to offend him. But they responded with only the stiffest, slightest of bows. Roaring Abel must be kept in his place. Valancy, behind them, did a thing they were fortunately spared seeing. She smiled gaily and waved her hand to Roaring Abel. Why not? She had always liked the old sinner. He was such a jolly, picturesque, unashamed reprobate, and stood out against the drab respectability of Deerwood and its customs like a flame-red flag of revolt and protest.
Only a few nights ago, Abel had gone through Deerwood in the wee smaws, shouting oaths at the top of his stentorian voice, which could be heard for miles, and lashing his horse into a furious gallop as he tore along prim, proper Elm Street. Yelling and blaspheming like a fiend, shuddered Cousin Stickles at the breakfast table. I cannot understand why the judgment of the Lord has not fallen upon that man long ere this, said Mrs. Frederick petulantly, as if she thought Providence was very dilatory and ought to have a gentle reminder. He'll be picked up dead some morning. He'll fall under his horse's hoofs and be trampled to death, said Cousin Stickles reassuringly.
Valancy had said nothing, of course, but she wondered to herself if Roaring Abel's periodical sprees were not his futile protest against the poverty and drudgery and monotony of his existence. She went on dream sprees in her Blue Castle. Roaring Abel, having no imagination, could not do that. His escapes from reality had to be concrete. So she waved at him today with a sudden fellow feeling, and Roaring Abel, not too drunk to be astonished, nearly fell off his seat in his amazement. By this time they had reached Maple Avenue and Uncle Herbert's house, a large, pretentious structure, peppered with meaningless bay windows and excrescent porches. A house that always looked like a stupid, prosperous, self-satisfied man with warts on his face. A house like that, said Valancy solemnly, is a blasphemy. Mrs. Frederick was shaken to her soul. What had Valancy said? Was it profane, or only just queer? Mrs. Frederick took off her hat in Aunt Alberta's spare room with trembling hands. She made one more feeble attempt to avert disaster. She held Valancy back on the landing as Cousin Stickles went downstairs. "Won't you try to remember you're a lady?" she pleaded. "Oh, if there were only any hope of being able to forget it," said Valancy wearily. Mrs. Frederick felt that she had not deserved this from Providence. Chapter 10. "Bless this food to our use, and consecrate our lives to thy service," said Uncle Herbert briskly. Aunt Wellington frowned. She always considered Herbert's graces entirely too short and flippant. A grace, to be a grace in Aunt Wellington's eyes, had to be at least 3 minutes long and uttered in an unearthly tone, between a groan and a chant. As a protest, she kept her head bent a perceptible time after all the rest had been lifted. When she permitted herself to sit upright, she found Valancy looking at her. Ever afterwards, Aunt Wellington averred that she had known from that moment that there was something wrong with Valancy. In those queer, slanted eyes of hers, we should always have known she was not entirely right with eyes like that. There was an odd gleam of mockery and amusement, as if Valancy were laughing at her. Such a thing was unthinkable, of course. Aunt Wellington at once ceased to think it. Valancy was enjoying herself. She had never enjoyed herself at a family reunion before. In social functions, as in childish games, she had only filled in. Her clan had always considered her very dull. She had no parlor tricks, and she had been in the habit of taking refuge from the boredom of family parties in her Blue Castle, which resulted in an absent-mindedness that increased her reputation for dullness and vacuity.
"She has no social presence whatever," Aunt Wellington had decreed once and for all. Nobody dreamed that Valancy was dumb in their presence, merely because she was afraid of them. Now she was no longer afraid of them. The shackles had been stricken off her soul. She was quite prepared to talk if occasion offered. Meanwhile, she was giving herself such freedom of thought as she had never dared to take before. She let herself go with a wild inner exultation as Uncle Herbert carved the turkey. Uncle Herbert gave Valancy a second look that day. Being a man, he didn't know what she had done to her hair, but he thought surprisedly that Doss was not such a bad-looking girl after all, and he put an extra piece of white meat on her plate. "What herb is most injurious to a young lady's beauty?" propounded Uncle Benjamin by way of starting conversation, loosening things up a bit, as he would have said. Valancy, whose duty it was to say, "What?" did not say it. Nobody else said it, so Uncle Benjamin, after an expectant pause, had to answer, "Time," and felt that his riddle had fallen flat. He looked resentfully at Valancy, who had never failed him before, but Valancy did not seem even to be aware of him. She was gazing around the table, examining relentlessly everyone in this depressing assembly of sensible people, and watching their little squirms with a detached, amused smile. So these were the people she had always held in reverence and fear. She seemed to see them with new eyes. Big, capable, patronizing, voluble Aunt Mildred, who thought herself the cleverest woman in the clan, her husband a little lower than the angels, and her children wonders.
Had not her son Howard been all through teething at 11 months, and could she not tell you the best way to do everything from cooking mushrooms to picking up a snake? What a bore she was! What ugly moles she had on her face! Cousin Gladys, who was always praising her son who had died young, and always fighting with her living one. She had neuritis, or what she called neuritis. It jumped about from one part of her body to another. It was a convenient thing. If anybody wanted her to go somewhere she didn't want to go, she had neuritis in her legs. And always, if any mental effort was required, she could have neuritis in her head. You can't think with neuritis in your head, my dear. What an old humbug you are, thought Valancy enviously. And Isabel. Valancy counted her chins. And Isabel was the critic of the clan. She had always gone about squashing people flat. More members of it than Valancy were afraid of her. She had, it was conceded, a biting tongue. I wonder what would happen to your face if you ever smiled, speculated Valancy, unblushingly.
Second cousin Sarah Taylor, with her great, pale, expressionless eyes, who was noted for the variety of her pickle recipes and for nothing else, so afraid of saying something indiscreet that she never said anything worth listening to, so proper that she blushed when she saw the advertisement picture of a corset and had put a dress on her Venus de Milo statuette, which made it look real tasty. Little cousin Georgiana, not such a bad little soul, but dreary, very, always looking as if she had just been starched and ironed, always afraid to let herself go. The only thing she really enjoyed was a funeral. You knew where you were with a corpse. Nothing more could happen to it. But while there was life, there was fear. Uncle James, handsome, black, with his sarcastic, trap-like mouth and iron-gray sideburns, whose favorite amusement was to write controversial letters to the Christian Times, attacking modernism. Valancy always wondered if he looked as solemn when he was asleep as he did when awake. No wonder his wife had died young. Valancy remembered her, a pretty, sensitive thing. Uncle James had denied her everything she wanted and showered on her everything she didn't want. He had killed her, quite legally. She had been smothered and starved. Uncle Benjamin, wheezy, pussy-mouthed, with great pouches under eyes that held nothing in reverence. Uncle Wellington, long, pallid face, thin, pale yellow hair, one of the fair Sterlings, thin, stooping body, abominably high forehead with such ugly wrinkles, and eyes about as intelligent as a fish's, thought Valancy. Looks like a cartoon of himself. Aunt Wellington, named Mary but called by her husband's name to distinguish her from Great Aunt Mary, a massive, dignified, permanent lady, splendidly arranged iron-gray hair, rich, fashionable beaded dress, had her moles removed by electrolysis, which Aunt Mildred thought was a wicked evasion of the purposes of God. Uncle Herbert, with his spiky gray hair, Aunt Alberta, who twisted her mouth so unpleasantly in talking, and had a great reputation for unselfishness because she was always giving up a lot of things she didn't want. Valancy let them off easily in her judgment because she liked them, even if they were, in Milton's expressive phrase, stupidly good. But she wondered for what inscrutable reason Aunt Alberta had seen fit to tie a black velvet ribbon around each of her chubby arms above the elbow. Then she looked across the table at Olive. Olive, who had been held up to her as a paragon of beauty, behavior, and success as long as she could remember. Why can't you hold yourself like Olive Doss? Why can't you stand correctly like Olive Doss? Why can't you speak prettily like Olive Doss? Why can't you make an effort, Doss?
Valancy's elfin eyes lost their mocking glitter and became pensive and sorrowful. You could not ignore or disdain Olive. It was quite impossible to deny that she was beautiful and effective, and sometimes she was a little intelligent. Her mouth might be a trifle heavy. She might show her fine, white, regular teeth rather too lavishly when she smiled. But when all was said and done, Olive justified Uncle Benjamin's summing up, a stunning girl. Yes, Valancy agreed in her heart, Olive was stunning. Rich, golden brown hair, elaborately dressed, with a sparkling bandeau holding its glossy puffs in place, large, brilliant blue eyes and thick silken lashes, face of rose and bare neck of snow rising above her gown, great pearl bubbles in her ears, the blue-white diamond flame on her long, smooth, waxen finger with its rosy, pointed nail, arms of marble gleaming through green chiffon and shadow lace. Valancy felt suddenly thankful that her own scrawny arms were decently swathed in brown silk. Then she resumed her tabulation of Olive's charms, tall, queenly, confident, everything that Valancy was not. Dimples, too, in cheeks and chin. A woman with dimples always gets her own way, thought Valancy,
in a recurring spasm of bitterness at the fate which had denied her even one dimple. Olive was only a year younger than Valancy, though a stranger would have thought that there was at least 10 years between them. But nobody ever dreaded old maidenhood for her. Olive had been surrounded by a crowd of eager beaux since her early teens, just as her mirror was always surrounded by a fringe of cards, photographs, programs, and invitations. At 18, when she had graduated from Havergal College, Olive had been engaged to Will Desmond, lawyer in embryo. Will Desmond had died, and Olive had mourned for him properly for 2 years. When she was 23, she had a hectic affair with Donald Jackson, but Aunt and Uncle Wellington disapproved of that, and in the end Olive dutifully gave him up. Nobody in the Sterling clan, whatever outsiders might say, hinted that she did so because Donald himself was cooling off. However that might be, Olive's third venture met with everybody's approval. Cecil Price was clever and handsome and one of the Port Lawrence Prices. Olive had been engaged to him for 3 years. He had just graduated in civil engineering, and they were to be married as soon as he landed a contract. Olive's hope chest was full to overflowing with exquisite things, and Olive had already confided to Valancy what her wedding dress was to be: ivory silk draped with lace, white satin court train lined with pale green georgette, heirloom veil of Brussels lace. Valancy knew also, though Olive had not told her, that the bridesmaids were selected and that she was not among them.
Valancy had, after a fashion, always been Olive's confidant, perhaps because she was the only girl in the connection who could not bore Olive with return confidences. Olive always told Valancy all the details of her love affairs, from the days when the little boys in school used to persecute her with love letters. Valancy could not comfort herself by thinking these affairs mythical. Olive really had them. Many men had gone mad over her besides the 3 fortunate ones. I don't know what the poor idiots see in me that drives them to make such double idiots of themselves, Olive was wont to say. Valancy would have liked to say, I don't either, but truth and diplomacy both restrained her. She did know perfectly well. Olive Sterling was one of the girls about whom men do go mad, just as indubitably as she, Valancy, was one of the girls at whom no man ever looked twice. And yet, thought Valancy, summing her up with a new and merciless conclusiveness, she's like a dewless morning. There's something lacking. And that's where we'll leave the story for today. Thank you for spending your time with Narrate the Tales. I'll see you in the next chapter.